Welcome everyone to the 8th installment of Under the Baobab, Conversation and Community in World History. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Laura Mitchell. I'm the president of the World History Association. It's an honor to have you here in this virtual space and to be part of a vibrant intellectual community that's finding a new way to work during our still unprecedented global pandemic and historical political protests in the US and around the world. I'm speaking to you today from Irvine, California, which is located on the homelands of the Ashamen and Tongva peoples, who, in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and to act as stewards of their ancestral lands, just as they have for the last 8,000 years. This series of online gatherings is part of the WHA's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and to the ongoing groundswell of anti-racist activism. We're having an annual meeting this year in 2021, hooray. And our affiliates have come back to beginning to host their conferences too. But we're still getting together on Zoom in these Baobab sessions to talk about research, teaching, and social justice. As a resource for others, this session is being recorded. Anyone who is here today who has ideas for future Baobab gatherings or publications in the World History Bulletin or World History Connected, please let us know by emailing us at info@thewha.org. I invite you to stay connected to the WHA through social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can get updates about new blog posts, which is another channel of communication we opened in response to the pandemic. Before we formally get started, a quick bit of housekeeping. Please keep your microphones muted during the plenary session to minimize background noise, but feel free to continue to use the chat function to connect with colleagues and to ask questions of our meeting hosts today. Now I'm going to turn the mic over to our WHA member and the chair of our Community College Committee, Jack Norton, who's the host of today's timely and engaging session. Thanks, Jack, for putting this together.
Thank you, Laura. Hello, welcome to all of you. I'm Jack Norton. I am the chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Normandale Community College here in the Twin Cities area, the Twin Cities Metro. I'm speaking to you from Minneapolis, from my home, which is on Dakota-Lakota Sioux territory. So I'm also, as Laura mentioned, the chair of the WHA Community College Committee. And like many of you, the majority of my students are not history majors. Nor will they go on to be professional history practitioners. Yet many of the students love history. Like they come to our classes with this kind of abiding love of some aspect of history, and they engage it oftentimes outside of class in formats that the people on our panel have mastered. So today's panelists do history in public in varied ways. I'll let them introduce themselves because they wear many hats, but let me offer two prefatory comments. One, as these panelists speak about their work, please take notes about how you might craft assignments that address public audiences. That is to model great work for your pedagogies so that you can see how other folks are doing things, blending history into a variety of different tools. My second comment is that again, like some of you, I stopped assigning work that I didn't want to read. The 5-page essay, compare and contrast, and I couldn't do it anymore. And so I now assign work that I'm interested in. Like I want to hear what my students have to say about certain historical subjects. I got away from what we might call educational broccoli, which is do it, it's good for you. And I got, I'm doing more things that kind of lift me up and lift the students up. It allows them to shine in their work. And so what I love about our panelists is that they do work that I want to engage in my free time. These are all folks who, when I have time away from my work, I will actually go and I will listen to a podcast or I'll watch a video series. I regularly will stick one of the two Davids, their newest work, and I'll open up a tab and stick on oh, I'm going to read that tonight when I've got time. I can think about it. And that's one of the things that I'm really excited about bringing to you guys today is that we've got meaningful, expert, sometimes humorous folks that really kind of enhance the and show the very best of what history can do in terms of opening doors to new insights. And so with those, just quick prefatory remarks, we'll turn to our panelists. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. We're going to take them in the order presented. We're going to start with Danae, and so I will turn the microphone over to you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Yat e she Danae dormianishe tabahan nishlin nakai dana bashashin totsoni dashache nakai dana dashanale. Hello, everyone. My name is Danae Dormy. I'm a citizen of the Navajo Nation, and I'm based here in Tiwa Ancestral Territory, which is also known as Albuquerque, New Mexico. And first, just want to say thank you so much for having me. I wear a couple different hats, and I am currently the Associate Director of College Horizons, which is a national nonprofit organization that supports Native American, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian students through the college application process and the financial aid application process. So we work with students from freshman year of high school all the way to graduate level studies. And my other hat is that part of the reason why I'm here today is that I am also the creator. Oops, sorry, you might hear my dogs barking. I'm also the creator and host of the Grounded podcast with Danae Dormy, which explores the intersection of land, community, culture, and running. So so like I mentioned, I think it's probably important for me to give some context to my background really before I dive into what I'm doing right now in terms of history and some freelance journalism. I was born and raised in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so I grew up in a space that was really at the cross section of many different cultures, languages, and communities. I think we have over 20 tribes here in New Mexico alone. So I was not in an environment where I was the minority necessarily, but I think it's important to point out that the one environment I was the minority in were my honors and AP classes since I was younger. So I know that there's a lot of educators on this call. My partner is actually an educator at the Native American Community Academy here in Albuquerque, and my dad is also an educator at my high school. So I've always been surrounded by by I think education in general, and that pushed me forward. But to look around classrooms and really understand that oftentimes I was going to be the only Native student in the room was something I think that I just became very used to by the time I was in AP US history, AP world history, and I had varying experiences with that. And I think a lot of these experiences come out in my podcast today and are behind or driving the work that I'm doing now. So, I I don't think I've actually ever had a history teacher until I had one Native studies professor in college that was that looked like me. And so I think that is something that I think about a lot now. And I think it's important to also mention that before I became the associate director of College Horizons, I worked as an admissions counselor at Yale University, where I received my bachelor's degree in women's gender and sexuality studies in 2015. So working for the admissions office and serving as the director of Native recruitment also informed this work and some of what I'm doing today. And I think all of these hats will probably make more sense here in a second, but that was really my first experience with understanding and soaking in just personal narrative from Native students around the country, from tribes that were not mine, from areas that were unlike where I was coming from. And I actually spent a majority of my college career as a history major. And I actually think it's important to recognize that I left that major because I did not feel welcome there. And I became a women's gender and sexuality studies major at Yale because it was a small niche community of scholars that they were really willing to support my work in terms of citing. I cited a lot of social media. I studied missing and murdered Indigenous women and the crisis and epidemic surrounding that in my own community. And a lot of the work that was happening was reshaping activism around that. And so I had to use a lot of sources that were on Twitter, that were on Instagram, that were people organizing in these non-traditional spaces. At least now I think maybe it might be a little bit more accepted, and I definitely see heads nodding. But at the time, I remember my history director of undergraduate studies telling me I really needed to find some different sources and I needed to do some deep dives into maybe, Indian law, maybe some political history, sovereignty. And I was trying to explain that that is what I was working to do, but I was just doing it through different voices, and I was doing it through the women that were organizing online primarily. So that was really my college. That was really, I think, a big part of my college experience was that I had to leave the history major itself. And my senior year, with one credit left in the history major, I pivoted to women's studies. So I think that probably gives a lot of context to my work today. And once I left my position with admissions, and I now do work in college access to help students really find the best fit college for them, and a college that has resources for them. I'm very grateful for the experience I had at Yale as a Native student, and we did have a Native student community, but like I said, really only one Native professor. I don't think I necessarily received the advising I deserved around graduate school and opportunities for Native students in history. So that, I think, has really driven me and got me to where I am today, which was applying to a fellowship through a major national sports brand, Tracksmith. I don't know if anyone here is aware of that, but they decided to fund 5 creators in the running industry who were going to push forward new and different conversations. So I applied for that last year during the pandemic. And since, I would say, about New Year's, about the beginning of this 2021, I've been running a podcast that focuses on the intersection of land, community, culture, and running and movement. So that has been a really interesting journey, because what I've found is that this podcast has provided an opportunity to hear from mostly Indigenous athletes, but also people of color in general. So I have a really diverse slate of guests. But something that I referenced that I wanted to bring up in this particular talk and conversation was a report that I think really contextualizes a lot of what I'm doing, that was done by Illuminatives, which is a nonprofit organization run by Native people, primarily Dr. Crystal Echo Hawk. And it was a 2-year, I believe it was over $3 million in terms of funding to research, basically go into public opinion, look at public opinion on Native people. And a lot of what that study found is that invisibility is the modern bias against Native people, and that a majority of Americans are actually not particularly clear on whether or not we exist. And so I knew that going into the podcast space, which is, I would say, pretty large right now. It's a very popular space and medium, but I'm still not seeing a lot of Native podcasters. I only have a couple people that I know in the field that I'm able to reference, and not a lot of Native journalists generally. And I think one of the reasons I leaned into podcasting is because journalism itself is also a very white and male dominated space, and podcasting offered me the opportunity to use my own voice as a Native person. So I started building what really felt like it was a project in portraiture. And I think I originally set out to talk more and dive more into the history of the land, which was really my project proposal. Was I wanted to talk to athletes to better understand the roads they were running on, the waterways they were using, the resources and the lands that they were occupying, because I thought this is a really good opportunity for me to educate people around who owns these lands, or think about land ownership differently. But what I learned is that I was actually just really tired of teaching. And I think that reshaped my perspective on the podcast. Is I was realizing all the way from basically kindergarten through college, I was often the teacher more than I was the student. I've had several teachers and professors ask me to look at their syllabus and add Native writers, Native authors, Native thinkers. And that wasn't my responsibility. I felt it was the responsibility of my teachers to look into that and find those resources for me, because I didn't often know. I was like 18 at the time. So I think when I got to the podcast space, I was like, man, this is just repeating itself. And it's not my job to necessarily do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to find a way to just have normal conversations that can really humanize and normalize Native people in the athletic industry, in modern spaces, because I think a lot of these history classes I was taking prior to being able to do this work, what we're really situating Native people as primarily in the past and as only existing and living in the past. And the conversations I was having in high school and even in a lot of the college history courses I was taking were mostly around the trauma and the violence that my community has faced. And so that was always an odd context to learn about myself within, because I had my own oral histories through my own family and through what I had learned growing up. And I knew that alongside all of that, there was also a pretty thriving like language and culture and community. And that wasn't really being shared in any of my classes. So one thing I wanted to bring into the podcast was this blend between formal and informal speaking. And if you listen to the show, I basically interview one athlete for an hour to an hour and a half every week, and we dive into questions around how their culture has informed the way they see the world. So it's not just a show for runners. It's really trying to get out, what has it been like to have to navigate this world and be responsible for maybe passing down your language, which may only have a few speakers, or how do you train using traditional foods, right? As a runner, like, can you incorporate traditional, like for me in my case, as an example, like blue corn mush, and I talk about that a lot in my podcast, which is a form of protein and it's very energizing, but like not something you're going to hear about in terms of nutrition on other running podcasts and in other spaces that talk about wellness. And I think just figuring out how I can further take down the blocks of just sort of decolonizing. I think that's a very overused word and have a lot of opinions about it, but decolonizing the wellness industry has been a really interesting journey, because I've realized that even as I've made Native people visible through these stories and through sharing these narratives, I'm finding myself still at times pigeonholed into being the spiritual guide for a lot of hikers, bikers, runners, walkers. And it's been this new lens to see the world. And so I just do what I can to have really candid conversations and really make sure that Native voices are centered here and uplifted. And since so many of the podcasts I do listen to are hosted by white people, generally just non-Native people, there is really, I think, not a very diverse guest list most of the time. There's not a lot of different voices coming from different tribal communities as well, because I think we typically hear from people who come from Lakota communities, Navajo communities, maybe Cherokee communities, but there's hundreds and hundreds of tribes, throughout North America that I feel like, in a way, a sense of responsibility to represent through my own show, as well as my own specific Navajo community. So I think breaking down these misconceptions has been a really big part of my goal around history and journalism, and this rather informal mode of speaking has proven to be really effective, because I've had a lot of unexpected outreach from college professors like this, but also from coaches, from higher education professionals, from high school teachers, and then also from college students who have said that it's been really important to have their experience validated, because I think as a student, I wasn't motivated to learn if the content wasn't relatable to me, if it wasn't going to be useful to me. I think as a Native student, it was most of the content I learned as a Native student told me that my people, were killed a lot of the time. Like, I think just very bluntly, I didn't really know how to take that when I was 15. And a lot of my teachers, I don't think, really understood how to speak to me about that either. So that's really the work that I'm doing now. And it's found this interesting way of blending with college access and using personal narratives and personal voices, which is a form of oral history that I think in my culture is very common. And that is another thing that I think has been shoved aside as a non-traditional medium, or as a non-Western way of thinking and recording information, because we record it in our minds and pass it down through our families. It's embedded into our art. It's embedded into our weavings, our songs, our language, our prayers. And so for me, it's also embedded into my podcast. And I think that's what I'm really focused on right now, is just sharing those honest stories in a way that can help teachers, help coaches, help athletes feel validated, but also find ways to make Native people visible in their classroom spaces and education spaces. So hopefully I can take questions after, but yeah, I think that's all from me.
Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and experience. Um, Next up, we have David Montgomery.
Thank you, Jack. Can everyone hear me? Great. Yes, so my name is David Montgomery. I'm a journalist also here in Minnesota, part of the big Minneapolis contingent here. I also host a history podcast called The Siècle, about which more in a few minutes. But just a little bit of a background, I've always, since I was a child, just loved history. It was always my favorite topic in school. School was not always a great source for history. When I grew up in the era of No Child Left Behind and teaching to the test, etc. And history is often sort of the first thing to fall by the wayside when you need to focus on math and English, etc. So I only took one history class in high school. There's only one history class I could fit into my schedule, which is U.S. history. So I ended up, even as far ago as high school, I signed up to a community college to take a history class at night because I wanted more social studies, more history than I was able to get during the day. I think the one that was available was a history of Islam, which was not something I would have researched on my own, but has been very informative ever since. But aside from history, my other passion for a long time has been news and journalism. Going back to my days writing, in retrospect, terrible articles for the high school newspaper, going to a couple conferences, that brief period of wanting to grow up to be Woodward and Bernstein, or Woodward and/or Bernstein. And so that's what I did after college. I was a political science major. My real major was the college newspaper, where I spent most of my time. Graduated from college and spent a number of years working as a political journalist, covering state and local politics in the Midwest and in South Dakota and Minnesota. Gradually sort of transitioned into data journalism, taught myself how to code, make graphs and maps and stuff like that. That's what I'm doing now here in Minnesota. And sort of behind all that was sort of, I think, a passion for communicating to the public. And particularly the sort of subset of journalism that's known as explanatory journalism. Not so much reporting on here's the latest turn to the screw of what happened, but helping people who aren't intensely clued into what's going on understand the big picture and what's going on and why it matters. And that's always what I've been interested in, which ended up being a mindset that was helpful a few years ago when I was in a brief period of unemployment in between jobs, and was looking for something to do that would be productive, that could occupy my time. I believe I was driving from Chicago to Minneapolis, listening to a history podcast in the car, and thought, hey, I could do this. I could do my own history podcast. That'd be a great way to fill some time. And the topic I ended up picking, I think before the car ride was over, was 19th century France, or specifically France in between the fall of Napoleon and World War I, aka the boring part that everyone skips over because there's more exciting things before and after. And to a certain degree, that's true, but to a certain degree, it's not. Which if it were boring, I wouldn't be 20 odd episodes in right now after a couple of years. But what I thought was the perfect topic, because it was something that most ordinary people know absolutely nothing about. But it was also a topic that there was a great deal of information out there. If I'd done a podcast on the history of ancient Assyria or something like that, it would have been absolutely fascinating. But I could probably read like literally everything that's ever been published on that topic, and would still have to do like, well, in this century, we think here's what happened. Whereas with this topic, there's so much information that I can literally go day by day in a lot of times if I wanted to. So it was right for popularization, which I think is a key aspect. There's a ton of history being produced in the academy for specialist audiences, which is doing great groundbreaking work, drawing on archives and theory and all sorts of stuff. But most people all these people out there like me who love history don't have the time or the background to really consume a lot of this specialized history that's being produced. So there's a huge audience for popularized history. But similarly, there's also a lot of bad pop history out there. And so I think that there's sort of a real spot for people who are willing to, who can thread that needle of being accessible to a broad audience, but also not dumbing it down to the point where it's wrong or misleading about history. And there's so many different fields out there that I think that fall in that area where they're intrinsically interesting, but most people don't know about them, and are just sort of ripe for that popularization. And it's just been an intensely rewarding process for me, because it's a podcast. I'm releasing episodes. That means I'm sort of working in bite-sized chunks. I'm not, disappearing for 3 years to write a book and then coming out at the other end. I put something out every month, and I get feedback on it. People say, "Oh, I love this episode. I didn't like this as much as the last episode. Could you tell more about this particular historical personage or this event?" I just coming from a journalism background where you're publishing on a daily basis. This approach is it works really well for me, and I think a lot for the audience. There's a lot of people who want to learn more about topics in that sort of bite-sized manner, where they can maybe devote half an hour or an hour every month to learning a little bit more. Originally, I was going to do every 2 weeks, but that schedule didn't last very long. So as I said, I think there's all sorts of topics out there that are ripe for this sort of popularization approach. There's this vibrant world of history podcasts in particular, a community of people who are doing topics about everything from the popes to the history of the Maori in New Zealand to history through various different lenses and angles. So like finding a key topic is important. There's almost certainly, unless your topic is the American Revolution or World War II, there's almost certainly a huge available niche out there. And even to those topics, with the right angle, you can find something new and find your audience. But it's also, I think, one of the things I've learned doing this is the importance of being accessible and producing stuff in a format that people can get to. And that there's sort of a lot wrapped up in that accessible term there. But I listen to a lot of history podcasts, but I'm primarily a written word guy. So I publish the full scripts to all my episodes on the website with footnotes and all that. But most of my audience wants to listen. They want to consume, to learn about history, not by sitting down and reading a long book, although many of them also like that. They want to be able to pop something in their ears when they're out for a run or doing housework or on a long drive or something like that. Similarly, there's a huge community on YouTube of explainer videos on various topics. That people there's just an intense interest. And so I think in all these areas that are not the sort of traditional forms in which history has been disseminated, of books and feature-length documentaries, etc., that there's all sorts of interesting ways and new ways being developed that provide opportunities to reach people where they are, to meet that need that's out there, that real passion that so many people have for history. And not every topic is going to be, not every podcast can be like the new Dan Carlin, for example, one of the more famous history podcasters. My own girlfriend finds my topic pretty boring and is probably a dozen episodes behind on listening to my history podcast, but she's fascinated by 20th century Chinese history. So even if not every topic is going to be successful with a huge mass audience, every topic has its audience out there if you can find it. And there's so many more opportunities still out there, but for people to find and communicate, to share to this public and meet that intense interest there. And you can even make some money off it. I've got a Patreon set up. I take in a couple $100 a month. Covers my costs and most of my book acquisition expenses, and if you get bigger, once you get past, I'm about 1,000 downloads per month, which is way more people than I thought I'd get when I started this podcast. But once you get into the 10,000 download category, then you can make some actual, real, legitimate money here, which can either be the opportunities to make it into a career or just a side gig, to not be reliant on the fickle world of grants out there. So there's lots of opportunities. I think that there's this huge demand out there for content that covers history in that threads that needle between not being too obscure, but also being quality. And so I'll stop there and hopefully take some questions later.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Varsha.
Yeah. So thank you all for inviting me to this. I'm Varsha Venkata-Subramanian. I am a graduate student at UC Berkeley. I'm a fourth year, as I was also an undergraduate at UC Berkeley in history and economics from 2012 to 2016. But my love of history did not start with undergrad. It began much, much earlier. I think it was around 7th grade with my 7th grade history teacher. She was talking about the Reformation. And I remember the way she taught was she would teach it like a story. And so that's really how I got hooked on history, is that at the end of each class, it would literally end in a cliffhanger. Like that was the first year that, I actually experienced lectures, but lectures, for like 12-year-olds. And so one day when she was talking about the English Reformation, not the English Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, I go up to her and I'm like, I still don't understand what exactly is the difference between Protestants and Catholics, because I grew up Hindu, I grew up Indian, I grew up an immigrant. I did not understand any of this stuff, especially because Europe was just so alien to me. I'd never visited, right? And so she gave me a look and she couldn't explain it. But then she offered me another textbook to go and read. And so then, after reading that, I was like, whoa, people are eating God. I'm very confused. And since then, I just really got hooked into it. But how I got really interested in this connection between history and journalism came next year when I took, usually in California, because I went to school in California, 8th grade is the first year you do US history in middle school. And so my US history teacher, she was a Japanese American. She had family who grew up or experienced the internment camps. But besides all of that, that was the year of the Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama primary. And so learning about the Civil War, learning about slavery, learning about Abraham Lincoln, learning about the presidency, learning about basically everything there is to know about all the horrible things that happened in US history as a 13-year-old, while a historic primary between a woman and an African-American candidate is going on, just completely opened my eyes. It totally changed how I thought about the political process in this country. It changed how I thought about history. And that, that year played a big role in how I think about, pedagogy and, thinking about history to this day. So that's where my sort of like journey began. And then when you get to high school, similar to David, I got really into French history, mainly because another teacher, and pedagogy is really important to my understanding of why I'm into history. Another teacher treated the French Revolution like a story. I'm pretty sure he made it up, but the day that I remember deciding that this was going to be like my life's work was he was talking about Louis XVI's execution, and he was like, at the Place de Revolution, there were people in the front row who could feel Louis XVI's blood splatter on their faces, and I was the only one in the room who was not disgusted. And I remember saying out loud, "That is effing awesome." Obviously, my teacher was not appreciative of my cursing, but I was obsessed. I was hooked, right? And then when you get to eventually, if you take AP classes, you get to AP US history, and my AP US history teacher really opened my eyes, not just to, understanding contingency, understanding historiography, understanding, who writes history and how they write history and how that changes. She really opened my eyes to this idea that, I could actually be a writer. I could be a communicator. right? And that really, excited me. And so when I got to college, the first thing I did, actually right after I got into Berkeley, there's this thing called Cal Day. It's like a visiting day for the undergraduates, right? The only reason I made my parents drive 6 hours from LA to Berkeley is to get me to the history meeting with the undergraduate history advisor and all the future history majors. And my parents, they were not happy that I was choosing history as a major. They wanted me to be a doctor, a different type of doctor. And then, when they gave up on the doctor dream because I could not dissect a fetal pig to save my life, they were like, okay, go do engineering. When they realized physics was not my forte, they were like, okay, you know what? Why don't you do business? After my first, when I was in college, after my first semester business class, I remember telling my dad, I was like, this is the stupidest class I've ever taken in my life. He's like, okay, but like, you have to find a job. Maybe you could go to law school. Right. And so they found ways to work around my passion for history. And I found ways to work around it as well. But all 4 years in college, I took history classes like somebody was chasing me from behind with like a gun pointed to my head. I think by the end of the 4 years, I'd taken around 30 classes, including the ones that I had audited. I had audited at least 7 or 8 graduate seminars by the time I had graduated undergraduate. And that was mainly because I just finally felt like I was in a conversation where I could actually say something, right? I'd love to talk. I'd love to, understand things. And I, could do that in any type of class. But in history classes, I could finally feel like I was actually, communicating something that I understood. And so when this pandemic started, it was my 3rd year of graduate school. I was studying for comps, and I was overwhelmed with comp studying. And so I remember, tweeting one day, wouldn't it be great if, we use Zoom for good and we spent like an hour talking to a random historian with a drink in hand about why they love history? And somebody who, Matt Gabriel, if you know him, he's a medievalist at Virginia, at the University of Virginia. He responded and he was like, this is a great idea. We must do this. And so after comps, we managed to schedule our first interview with Kevin Cruz. And so Kevin Cruz is like, the perfect example of a public historian nowadays, right? Especially back then, which was, 2020, which was basically the end of the Trump era. And so, we approached this webcast as a way to convey to the public that historians are not just normal people, but the things that they do are really cool. The way they do history is really cool. And so that's why usually, we do it with a drink in hand, but obviously all drinkers are welcome. And that's really how we got into it, is to, explain to people who tune into our webinars, who watch the YouTube videos, that this is what being a historian looks like. This is what they're interested in. This is how they got into the gig. And this is why it's important, right? And usually our episodes sort of end up linking with some sort of public event that's going on at the time. Either it was the Black Lives Matters protest last year, or it was, the election, or it was the transition period when we had Eric Rauchway talk about the transition period, Hoover and FDR, right? And so that's one of the other major things that that I like about the webcast. And so how this sort of relates to my pedagogy is whenever I'm teaching a history class, especially because I've been teaching history as a graduate student instructor, mainly during the Trump era, if I can be so bold to call it that. I taught my first class, my US history class. I've taught US history surveys twice, both halves twice. And they were both, all 4 classes were during the years 2017 to 2020, right? And so attendance in those classes were very high, especially the second half of the survey. And so I decided that, like, my focus in these classes was going to be, on 4 main things. The first is contingency, because that's really what gets me excited. This idea that nothing in history, especially US history, especially if you're trying to understand links in US political history, nothing is foreordained. Everything is contingent. Everything is path dependent. And that's really what gets students excited. And that's something that I like to bring up on the webcast as well. I like to ask, what what historians' favorite like primary sources are that sort of like brought them into this. What is the craziest story that they did when they were conducting an oral history interview, right? Like what is the moment that they think everything changed? The next thing that I sort of bring in into my classes is a little controversial depending on what subject you teach, but it's empathy, right? It's historical empathy. It's this idea that you are going to try to put yourself in the shoes of the people that you're studying. Obviously, that's difficult when I'm teaching about, you know, racists during the California labor movement in like the late 19th century, or if I'm teaching about racists like Calhoun, for example, right? We were talking about Calhoun before the episode started. But generally, I really like to get students to think in the mindset of the historical actors that we're learning about. And the best part about that is, you know, the way that Berkeley historians teach US history is historical actors are not just dead white guys. They are women, they are Native Americans, they are African Americans, they are formerly enslaved people, they are enslaved people, they are activists. And so you get to really get a full breadth of what it felt like to grow up, to fight in a war, to live in the United States during a certain period when you take a US history class at Berkeley, regardless if it's a survey class or an upper division class. And so I really like to focus on empathy. And that's something that I like to bring into the webcast as well, right? Like to get people watching to think about, why does this one medieval author like really matter? Like how can you put yourself in the mindset of that? You know, when we were talking about sexuality and nuns with a certain historian, we were like, so wait, can you tell us exactly how horny were these nuns? Like, right? Like what is actually going on here? And so I think that's one of the best things about the webcast. That's one of the best things about teaching, even over Zoom, right? The last thing, and this is where history and journalism sort of come in, is analogy. That's the most common reason a lot of students, if they are not history majors, or even if they are history majors, will take a US history class. That's one of the main reasons they might take a Chinese history class or a Latin American history class, is because they will read something in the news. And, you know, some journalist out there who may or may not have a history degree, most likely not, will try to be like, this is the new FDR. This is the new Nazism. This is the new, you know, collapse of the Roman Empire. And so my favorite part about teaching US history or you know, talking, you know, during this webcast is to deconstruct these common analogies that you see in the news and see what is useful from them and what is not useful. Right. And so I also run like a very small newsletter, like not a lot of people read it, but one of the last pieces that I did was there was a huge debate during on Twitter last year about fascism and whether or not Trump was a fascist, right? And so I sort of deconstructed the fact that a lot of people were you know, talking about two very different things. People who were against the term were thinking that everyone was comparing, you know, Trump and the United States to specifically the Weimar Germany, to specifically, you know, the Nazi regime. And then the other half of people who were pro calling certain people like Donald Trump a fascist were saying, no, what's interesting is that there's a whole history of American conservatism and fascism that has not been fully and truly examined. And so that's the best part about analogy. And so when you read, you know, articles from people who write in the Washington Post, right, like the Made by History articles, or if you read Contingent magazine, or if you read any of these other, you know, really great pieces where scholars are historians, and they are trying to talk about the present day, that's what they're really trying to do. And that's what I try to do in my classes. So they try to say that the analogy is not simple. It is not one-on-one. It's not even 1-to-2. You really have to dig deep and think about what you are allowed to pull from history and what you have to leave behind. And so that's why Drinking with Historians has been really valuable, is because we've been able to interview people who are, you know, medievalists, French historians, historians of Latin America, Native American historians, US historians. And when you're able to see how all these different types of historians and all their various subfields do their job, it's really easy to see it's really easy to understand how to teach analogy, how to avoid presentism, which is such a dirty word, but it's not, it shouldn't be in your classes. And then the last thing, which is something I learned from my AP US history teacher, and why I desperately wanted one day to be able to write a book, was so what? I mean, this is something that a lot of history teachers teach when they're trying to teach writing, is like, so what are the stakes, right? Like, why does this matter? And so that's one thing that I love about the webcast. And that's one thing that I love about teaching, is by the end of a webcast, by the end of a course, you're able to show your students the answer to this so what question. Why does this matter? Sometimes that's really easy because I teach US history. And so it's very clear to see why this matters if I'm teaching about, you know, the welfare state, or if I'm teaching about the Bretton Woods system, or if I'm teaching about, you know, Native Americans, but sometimes it's very difficult. And so I think that's one of the best things about the pandemic, oddly enough, is that teaching over Zoom, I've been able to really focus in on these 4 things: teaching contingency, teaching empathy, teaching analogy, and teaching so what. And the webcast has just, you know, helped that even more. And the final thing that I wanted to bring up is Twitter. And so I know Twitter isn't really, you know, it scares people sometimes because it is a huge time suck. But recently I wrote a small piece in the AHA's magazine Perspectives about using Twitter. And Twitter, I wrote about, you know, using Twitter as networking. But I think the best thing about Twitter is that you can find this huge and massive community of historians online who are doing very different or very similar work to you. And it's the best starting point if you want to start writing something or recording something or doing something that you think is maybe just a little bit outside of your field, right? So for example, when I started working on American conservatism for like a small thing that I'm writing, I went to Twitter to ask what do historians of American conservatism think about this term fascism? What are the major pieces that I should read? And you get to do the same thing if you are asking advice on what song to play when you're teaching about the Vietnam War, or if you're asking advice on what are the best primary sources when you're teaching about the Protestant Reformation, for example, right? And so Twitter is a great way to see that pedagogy is constantly changing. And to touch upon what Danae mentioned, it's a great way to bring in the voices that you think haven't been represented historically. And that's sort of how I got into if people know, my dissertation topic is dams. And I got into that mainly because I was in a history of development seminar my senior year of college. And I realized that this guy, David Lilienthal, who was the head of the TVA, who'd gone to India in 1951, starts writing about how if everybody just, you know, got together and dammed the Indus River and split the waters evenly between India and Pakistan, these countries might stop fighting about Kashmir, right? And this was one of the few things we read about India that semester. And I remember taking this to my now current advisor, this article, and I was like, I think I want to write about this. And he's like, yes, this is what you must do. And he gave me like a huge stack of books, the first one being Cadillac Desert by Mark Reisner. And that's really how I got interested in this idea that history is not just for people who are, you know, stuck in a so-called ivory tower and learning things that other people don't care about, but history is something that can be used to this day, right? And so when you are studying things like environmental history or water policy history, you realize it has a huge impact on understanding how water policy works today. And so that's, in conclusion, that's why I love teaching, why I love this webcast that I do, and, you know, why I love history. Thank you.
Thank you, Varsha. And now for our final panelist, David Perry. I'm going to note that we, at the end of David's presentation, we'll take questions, and we'll take questions in the chat. So if you want to form your questions, and we can queue them there so that we can answer them with some efficiency, and so we can kind of distribute them. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, that'll be great. And then after I've asked it, if there's a quick follow-up, then the panelists themselves can reach out to the person that's asked the question if there's something that needs a clarification. So with that, David.
Thanks so much. I have a little slideshow here, just a couple of clips that I'm going to pop up. I have done in the last few years a lot of different panels about history and journalism. And I am pretty sure this is the first one that did not have anyone in a faculty position. Um, and I think that's great. Obviously, I hope that anyone on this panel who wants a faculty position receives that which they desire. I am a former history professor, and I'm currently staff. I advise all the history majors at the University of Minnesota. It's about 300 of them, and all the minors, and do curriculum development. So I'm staff. I was a professor at Dominican University, and partially a wonderful little school in the Chicago area. I was there for 10 years, and I left a tenured full professorship in part because of journalism. So maybe it's a cautionary tale. I'm just going to kind of run through my experiences. In some ways, although David is a working journalist, his history is not part of that. So in some ways, I'm the one, and I know Varsha as well has written a little bit, and I hope does a lot more, doing kind of traditional in the newspapers, sort of formal and magazines journalism about history. So I'm going to focus on that. This was my first piece. This is a litany of things I've been mad about. My writing comes from a position of rage. And so in 2006, I had just finished my dissertation at the University of Minnesota, and I was mad about the ways in which George Bush, Pope Benedict, and Osama bin Laden, and lots of other people were talking about the Middle Ages as if the things happening in 2006 were medieval. And I want to talk about how they're not. I wrote an op-ed, a friend helped me format it. It ends up on the Sunday, the cover of the Sunday paper opinion section. So it's the front page of the opinion section here in the Star Tribune, which David Montgomery helped me find the PDF of yesterday. You can see there's this guy with a sword and some really weird, spangly, sparkly boots. They are not particularly authentic medieval boots. It's a weird thing, right? Because you hand your writing over to other people and then they frame it in the way that they think will get readers. I walked into a coffee shop at a grocery store on that Sunday morning, and I saw a stranger reading my article, which is someone who had just written a 500-page dissertation on and defended it on medieval relic theft. Was a weird thing to see a random guy at a coffee shop reading my writing. I could tell you that I was hooked, and I was, but over the next 6 years, as I moved into a faculty position, I wrote 3 op-eds, including this one. As I wrote my book, I wrote articles, I had a second kid, all the other things that go into life. So it's not like I wrote this op-ed and then became a journalist. I wrote 3 in 6 years. And when I do workshops on how to do this work, I always emphasize that's actually what I'm really looking for. I'm looking for moments where, out of love or confusion, or for me, rage, you want to intervene in a public conversation to that it's doable. And that's what most historians, at least in the faculty world, end up doing. Is every couple of years they jump in, and I think that's really important. So here I am. I'm mad at George Bush and Pope Benedict. 2 years later, during the presidential election of 2008, I was mad about how really all sides of the media were talking about Trig Palin, this son of Sarah Palin. My son has Down syndrome. So this isn't historical at all, right? Although it is informed by my work as an academic, because when I had my son who had Down syndrome, one of the things I did is I did the reading. I got out a lot of books on disability and Down syndrome, and I listened to experts and people with lived experience, and I read novels, and I tried to educate myself the way I'd been trained about this new life I was living. And I was frustrated about the language, so I wrote this piece. 2012, again, 6 years. I was mad. I was more frustrated. I was mad at Ann Coulter, who used the R word to refer to President Obama, but I was frustrated that the response was to say people with Down syndromes are angels. And I always like to say the word angel is also dehumanizing. It's nice, it's friendly dehumanization, but it's still, an angel is not human. And I'm very interested in positive stereotypes in very sort of dry academic ways, language and discourse. But I thought there was a way I might be able to reach out to a broader audience to talk about the complexity around positive stereotype. And there's lots of other people who, you can look at the people who write about model minority and any number of other categories of difference, and the ways in which difference can be rendered strange through and alien and other through positive stereotypes as well as through negative ones, even if in a more friendly way. No one who calls my son an angel means anything bad by it, and yet it is still dehumanizing. So here I am on CNN, and that was a surprise. But in the context of the news and the election and people shouting about Ann Coulter, there was an opportunity to jump in. 2013, and I always like to frame this around my academic career, I had turned in my book. I had turned in my tenure file. My wife had graduated and started working. A lot of, it was in a different phase of my life in terms of where my career was. I was mad because the Pope retired and everyone was comparing it to the 15th century when a Pope retired, when obviously the better comparison was the 13th century, as any 13th century historian, which is what I am, knows. And I was just ranting around it on Facebook, and people said, write an op-ed. And I said, no one wants to read an op-ed about the 13th century versus the 15th century. But if you remember, if you were paying attention in 2013, when the Pope retired, it was international news and it was a surprise. So no media outlet had prepped their content. You know, when the Super Bowl happens or the inauguration or anything, the Oscars, whatever it is, anything that's predictable, opinion sections in newspapers have their writers lined up. You cannot really break in. But when a surprise happens and it's relevant to something, for Varsha, it's a dam that bursts or something. You know, bad news about dams would be a good example. There's probably rarely good news about dams, at least if it's a surprise, right? But bad news about dams, that's an opportunity. People want to have expert commentary, and they haven't already hired someone. So I sent this email. I sent it, I remember, at Central Time. I still have the emails, like as PDFs of them, at 7:59 a.m. And by 8:02 a.m., 3 minutes later, I had a CNN contract because Pat, my editor there, one of my many wonderful editors of CNN, was looking for content and commentary on this global news event that had caught everyone by surprise. And so I was able to write about 13th century Italian papal history for CNN. And that continued because the next pope, our current pope, Pope Francis, named himself after a 13th century Italian saint. So here I am, a 13th century Italianist, with really about a 3 or 4 month news cycle that suddenly I can contribute in. And that is when I really started to get excited about doing this kind of journalism work as a historian, but also just as an activist and a person. Because the big piece I had, the first piece that got certainly around 1 million readers, I was not talking mad about medieval history. I was mad about patriarchy. I was mad that my 4-year-old daughter had been given a prize in her preschool. All the kids have been given prizes, and the boys got best engineer and best athlete, and girls got things like best friend, and my daughter got best dressed. And I have taken and now taught women's studies, gender theory classes. I know this work. I knew about gender norming from birth. It wasn't a surprise to me, but I was really mad. And so I wrote this piece, and it did very well in terms of readership. And it is just like that one guy at Caribou. It's really quite telling when you write something and you care about it and you know something and people actually read it. That's a really special, whether it's 5 people, as has happened to many of my blog posts, or 1 million people, as happened to this piece and a few others along the way. On last Monday, I was mad along with my friend Matt, who is also Varsha's co-host. He's the absent panelist here. I was mad about how people were using historical analogies, much as Varsha was saying, focusing particularly on the use of Holocaust analogies to anti-vaccination and McCarthyism to Hollywood racists being fired, but also wanting to defend, again, as Varsha sort of led us through already, the use of analogy with context and thought, not just to say you can't compare to the past, but that we have to be much more thoughtful about it. And so here's a Washington Post piece just last Monday. I've written about 450 pieces now of different styles, but it really came out of this, rage. I mean, I smile about it, but in fact, it is a functional way to address things that were upsetting me. But also the ways that the media works, so that if you have expert commentary and it's relevant to the news, and you know how the industry works. This is sort of just a little slide I put together from some of my workshops where I teach this stuff. You know how the industry works. You can enter into a particular kind of conversation as a historian, and I think it's really worthwhile. And there's no question that those are all my slides. I'm gonna say just 2 or 3 more things. There's no question that during the pandemic, there has been a real hunger for, as there always is during times of crisis, a real hunger for commentary from people who know things and study things. There has been a hunger from students in classroom contexts or just in my more informal meetings, but certainly in the media as well, just thinking about journalism, and that it is good for the profession for us to engage this. But also, if we don't do it, it will get written anyway. I have a list of 20 essays comparing COVID to the Black Death. that essentially all say the Black Death ended feudalism, maybe COVID can end capitalism. I have essay after essay that makes that argument. And for one thing, the Black Death didn't end feudalism because there's no such thing. There were economic systems in the 13th and the 14th century that did shift in interesting ways around the time of the Black Death. That's a longer conversation. And COVID is not ending capitalism. So here we have these essays, right? And this is a moment in which when things happen, this is the final thing. When things happen and historians know something, it is really worth trying to engage in that broader public conversation. Thanks.
All right. Thank you to all of you for your expertise, your insights, your varied perspectives. I'll be honest, I'm kind of overwhelmed. Like, there are so many interesting, I feel like I could sit down with any of you and have an 8-hour conversation punctuated only by good food. So I will pivot because I don't want, I want to give all of the people that have joined us today a chance to ask you questions. And so I will start with, how do you strike a balance? And this comes from Jonathan Reynolds. How do you strike a balance between developing a quote targeted niche audience and trying to grow a broader audience? All right, Varsha, and yeah, please feel free to jump in, and we'll just kind of rotate through as you find appropriate.
I think the best thing about the Drinking Historians webcast is that we have professional historians on, but we also have people who are not professional historians. Like, we've had people who are like Dana Schwartz and others who basically work in history, but they work sort of outside of it, right? They're not academic historians. And that's a great way to sort of, have this. The fact is, like, the initial audience was probably, if we look at the first episode, I'm assuming the people who attended and people who watched were probably all graduate students who loved US history, right? Or maybe US history professors. But as we have chosen different types of people to interview, we've tried to grow that audience into people who are maybe more, high school teachers, or people who are just history aficionados. And that all has to do with the types of people you choose to interview, or basically the type of content you try to put out, right? So let's say, if it's not a webcast, if it's a podcast, or if it's journalism that you're doing, if it's writing that you're doing, changing the type of information that you're putting out is how you're sort of growing your audience. But the best way to have that balance, in my opinion, is to make sure that you stick to a similar type of, if not message, at least like way of doing things. Right. And so generally, when we have an interview with somebody, we always try to ask similar questions, which is, how did you get into this? Why did you choose a specific subject? What is your favorite thing about the subject? What does the pop culture look like about this subject, right? We always end up asking that question, regardless of the type of historian that we interview. And so having that, sort of a theme or sort of similarity in the types of questions that you're maybe trying to answer and the type of content you're putting out is the best way to strike a balance, because you know that you're going to get the same type of people always reading your work, listening to your work, watching your work, but based on the subject that's changing, you might be able to grow.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit, my mic is on. In history podcasts, at least, there's sort of the big categorization split is between serialized and episodic podcasts. Basically, there's some people, this is the category I fall into, that are telling a single serialized story over an extended period of time. I'm going mostly chronologically through the period from 1814 to 1914. I jump around a little bit, and I have some more thematic episodes in there. But it's all in order, and I try to make a point, like, I reintroduce. You don't have to have listened to previous episodes to understand what's going on, but it helps a lot. And the other is the episodic, where it's a different topic every week, or maybe maybe you do a short series, but then you jump around a lot. And the latter is a much lower barrier to entry. I think it's much easier to reach a mass audience if you're not specializing in a single topic, but it's just like an approach that you're tuning into. And certainly, if I were to give someone advice who wanted to start a history podcast, it would be to start with that sort of episodic approach, because I think it's easier to produce and easier to and more accessible to a broader audience. But there is an intense audience out there for people who want to learn about a single topic in detail. just in chunks. And there are some very successful history podcasts in that category. So there's a choice you have to make about, are you going to go deep into one topic, or are you going to jump around to sort of a more accessible approach?
All right, we have a longer question. I'm going to just take the end of it. And so the person's a librarian, activist, and writer, and their question is, when writing about recent local history, what is the Venn diagram of historians' tools and journalists' tools? And is that an important distinguish, as well as they're looking for some resources to learn about how to do that?
I don't think that it is important to distinguish. I guess I would say that when I went the other direction, when I first wrote my first reported piece, it was about small Catholic universities and their really quite remarkable outreach to undocumented students. It was on my campus, but I discovered there's a pattern. It wasn't being reported. I talked to lots of people around the country. I developed 50 pages of notes of interviews, and I sat down and I wrote a 1,200 word piece for the Chronicle. And I discovered it was exactly the same set of skills that I'd been using to write about medieval relic narratives, where again, I had pages and pages of notes from my sources, and then I had to tell a story. The specifics vary, but for me, the skill set is in fact the same. Many of my favorite journalists doing, Pulitzer Prize work are either in fact historians or working very much like historians in their own ways, but many of them in fact have BAs in history. I tell everyone, if you want to be a journalist, get a BA in history. I might be a little biased there, but we're among friends, so I'm a stand by it. But I really don't think that the skills are all that different. And I guess I just want to add also, I think that people in the profession of history are often not doing enough, either through ignorance or disdain or just time, are not doing enough connecting with people really working with local history. One of my best friends, she knows the history of the southwestern corner of Minneapolis dating back to about 150 years, house by house, better than anyone. She was just involved in the recovery of a bell that was stolen that belonged to the Navy. Big story. She was the historian involved in that. I think she did get her BA recently, but she just did it. She just did the research. She did the work. She knows it house by house. She in particular knows the very complicated, including involving, Native genocide history of Minnehaha Falls and the Fort Snelling Badota area. This is for local people. She goes house by house in her work, and she might come more from. In some ways, the things she's doing might seem more from the librarian local history background, but it is history, and I think the skills. I think historians like me involved in history departments, even though I'm not faculty now, need to do more work connecting with local history groups. Because just like everyone said, there's an audience for history. There are lots of people making history in lots of different ways. And the people who are historians with PhDs and faculty positions need to do more work being more inclusive about what history is, and bringing and opening doors and making connections.
Just very quickly, I agree with David. The skill set is the same. I think the biggest difference between journalism and history is in journalism, you don't know how the story ends yet. But more broadly, you don't have the context that you have when you're writing about something that's in the past, and it's easier to have that broader view than when you're writing about something that's happening right now or even just a couple of years ago. So that there's some differences that come out of that distinction there, that you don't know the ending, you don't have necessarily the context, you don't know what's going to turn out to be important. But the skill set in terms of maybe you talk to more people when you're writing about something current because people are still alive, unlike medieval popes. But you're still interrogating sources, whether written or living, and then turning that into a written narrative.
Yeah, just I want to add some really quick. I won't repeat too much, but something that David Perry mentioned was surrounding yourself with people in terms of your local history. And the research that I do through the podcast is oftentimes, like, a lot of people think I just know things. Like, they think when you're native, you just happen to know whose homelands you're standing on anywhere. So that's something I've encountered so much, is that people think it's just I'm born with this knowledge, and a lot of the times I'm coming at it with the same knowledge that some of my listeners are coming at it. Some of my non-native listeners, you know, I don't know the history of somebody in Alaska very well unless they're from exactly my homelands or my area. So a lot of my land acknowledgements and my episodes are not built off of these formalized maps and things that you find online, because a lot of those maps are incorrect and they're not vetted. And so I think there's not, to my knowledge, as a Native academic, you know, and I just have yet to really find a heavily vetted and well done Native land map. And that's because there's a lot of debate over whose territories fall, in cross sections and overlapping areas. And so I rely heavily on the experiences of my friends and information that I've gained through being a part of, I'm a powwow dancer, so I travel a lot through powwows. And I think like that gives me this like unique perspective. And that's why I do think land acknowledgements have to be led by Native people. So that just that little piece of my show, that research comes from, yes, sometimes I'm Googling, sometimes I'm using this, research background. My mom is a librarian, so I have a lot of skills around how to look something up, honestly. But I think it's really that personal experience, that community building is so important. Surrounding yourself with people who have knowledge that you may not carry is really important.
So the next question actually is for you, Danae. Again, there's a longer context here with reference to a podcast called Girl Trek by Vanessa Garrison and Morgan Dixon. And the query is, do you know about these? And the question is talking through their responses to white folks, especially white women. And the question is, when there is limited airtime in the public sphere, occupied by voices of BIPOC communities, do you worry about listeners appropriating your work?
No, I think I make my own airtime, and that's why I love podcasting because every week, if you're my listener, you listen to me for an hour and a half. So I think to me, that's not limited airtime. I can take as much time as I need or want in explaining a topic I feel passionately about or having a conversation with someone. And I'm pretty explicit in my show, if you are a regular listener, about the fact that my show is not shaped to educate non-native people. So I function normally as I would with my friends and other people of color and other students of color, so that there is an open, honest space, because I think it will inherently educate non-native or white people. But I think that's going to come from the fact that it's not always polished. It's not always, there so that other people can understand necessarily. And I think sometimes that can be more helpful, because I don't encounter a lot of those sources. I think it took, just like I mentioned earlier, it took me really until my senior year of college that I really started learning, the ins and outs of sovereignty and native history and things like that, because everything I had learned up until that point was so surface level. I mean, it was concepts my parents had to talk to me about when I was like 10. So, the level, the lack of just knowledge and savvy around native history, I think in a lot of these high level spaces was really astonishing to me, even at a place like Yale, that it really was my native professors that allowed me to explore these topics at a deep level. Like I could analyze it, I could ask complex questions because I had the context for these topics. And so I try to replicate that in my podcast. And sometimes at the end of the podcast, I feel like I've just left section, because I'm like, okay, we were asking some questions of each other, that went deeper than running and just community outreach, but really had to do with how we are perceived, and how this specific piece of our culture or land ownership or our citizenship impacts how we run or how we move through this industry and the outdoor industry. So no, I'm not particularly worried about that. I think I'm willing to have any conversation, and I actually have yet to have a white athlete on my show. And so at some point I will. I'm committed to a diverse slate of guests, and I want to have conversations as to what that means to occupy the space very differently than, an Indigenous person or someone that's a person of color that was maybe displaced or has a shared experience and narrative as me. So yeah.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Prudence Africa, who is a student, master's student at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, and this is for Varsha. I realize that you guys can see all these, so I may be trying to replicate functionalities that I don't need to. And so, Varsha, do you see her question in the chat? Okay, then
Yeah.
I'm really just talking here for no purpose. So I'll
Yeah.
let you just answer that question.
Yeah, so Prudence, you make a really good point about, when you're studying historical contingency or you're trying to teach historical contingency, should you bring up the term the longue durée, right? And I like to, especially even if I'm not teaching French history. I've never gotten to teach French history, obviously, but if I'm teaching US history, I do like to bring up the study of not just like the term the longue durée, but also trying to think about what does it mean to study a long arc of history, to study processes that take decades, maybe sometimes centuries. Maybe take centuries to sort of complete, right? And I'm not aware of the book, The History Manifesto. I have read David Armitage, but I haven't read that book. But I think the best sort of resource to sort of try to understand at least what I'm interested in when it comes to contingency and when it comes to the longue durée is there is a book by Eric Foner. I think it's called Who Owns History, if I'm correct. Yes, it is Who Owns History. And that is the book that I read back when I was a high schooler. It was the summer reading before my AP US history class. It was my first Eric Foner that I'd ever gotten to read. And obviously the obsession began early. But that is a really great book to sort of understand exactly what does historiography sort of mean, right? And so I think the thing is you have to link contingency with historiography, in my opinion, because yes, historical contingency is like, yeah, anything can happen at any time. But if you bring in historiography with that, you sort of realize, oh, the reason anything can happen at any time is because the historians who are writing over time, they not only change their opinions, but they change their opinions because of a change in sources, because of change in power, because of a lot of other different changes, right? And so like a great example of that is when you're teaching slavery to high schoolers or to college students, teaching them the historiographical change in the slavery scholarship. That's a great way to teach contingency. That's a great way to sort of teach how does the 20th century look when it comes to racism against African Americans. If you look at the study of history of slavery, you can see how the history of racism sort of looks. So yes, I do study the longue durée. I do use the longue durée, especially as an environmental historian, because environmental changes take, don't just mean a dam bursting on one day, but they also take decades, sometimes centuries. Who Owns History is a great option if you're trying to understand how to teach historical contingency.
So I have a question. When I teach my students, we navigate these public and private spaces, particularly digitally. And so most of their work they produce in private spaces. And that's partly because I just want them to feel free to operate, because public space often gets filled with privilege. And so I want them to be able to kind of express and wrestle with that ideas. But I do have them do some public work. Sometimes I do. They write a blog entry. And it's for learning purposes. But every once in a while, somebody will wander across the blog, and it says right across the top, this is a blog for community college students to learn how to write history and blog. And somebody will write it about it, and I've got the comments shut down. They come directly to me. So they never showed to my students, but somebody's wrong on the internet. I'm like, all right, that's great. But it makes me really aware of how privilege operates within a lot of these digital spaces. And, David, I know has navigated this. I'm strongly suspicious that some of you have navigated this. I've seen some examples, but the short version of this is, how do you deal with the haters? What is it when you've got folks, you're producing this, this interesting, rich, robust material, and you get people simply because of who you are or the subject that you're dealing with, they object, like they don't. And it's not that they're making a reasoned argument, they're just coming at you. And then you have to navigate it because you are in this public space. And so I'm wondering, what are your, because I never want to subject my students to additional abuse. I want to teach them, as to produce this, and then when they go out there, they can choose if they want to be in the public sphere. So how do you deal with the haters? And maybe you're like, I don't have haters, which is great, but I know some of you do.
I have plenty of haters. Though I always like to say when I get waves of hate, it's because I'm Jewish. And otherwise, the fact that I am a white cis male protects me from a lot, and that I've written about abortion and guns and the death penalty and politics and plenty of other topics that are extremely contentious topics in American society that often do trigger waves of hate. And I get a fraction compared to my colleagues who are not white men. And when it gets bad, it's because I'm Jewish, and that's where the attacks come. With a few exceptions. I did have an international petition launched to kick me out of the classroom, but for one, I'm already out of the classroom. And for two, I work at a public university, and my communications team is a professional communications team that has read the First Amendment. The First Amendment's actually behind me on my wall too, though not in a Zoom-friendly format. But so it was not a problem. But that wasn't even hateful. When it's hateful, when it's aggressive, it's around being Jewish, and it's a real problem. I would 100% under no circumstances create an assignment that place students in any actual public space. I think that is an unethical thing to do. Creating situations where if they want to make it public, I think giving them the tools is important, because having more people make more media is one of the themes of this panel and is really important. But never, ever would I say, yeah, we're going to have an open Twitter conversation, which, your participation grade depends on it. I think that would be unethical. Even if, 99.99% of the time it would just go unnoticed like everything else on Twitter. Still, I think it would be unethical to do that. What to do about abuse and hate is a long conversation, and I don't want to derail it. I mean, it's a whole workshop. And quite possibly my colleagues here have other things they want to say. So I'll just say this. You owe your students a lot. You don't owe the people on Twitter or social media or in your inbox anything. I get 10-page emails. I read the first sentence and I hit archive. I hit archive rather than delete, just in case they keep emailing me so I can send it to the cops. That has never happened to me, but it has happened to plenty of my peers. I read one sentence. They send me 10 pages. I don't owe them 10 pages. Nazis start tweeting at me. I hit delete. Someone who I think is even a little bit off, I hit block. And then I run a script to block everyone who follows them as well. This happened in a thread about Thomas Becket. The Nazis found me, and it was, medieval history, but there they were. And so, it took me about 20 minutes of work, and then they were gone, and they're all gone. I don't owe them. Sometimes people come in and it seems like they're just asking questions, but you start to get that sense, and it develops that maybe this isn't a good faith interlocutor. Well, if they're a student, I'd have to keep answering them, because that's my job as a teacher. I am not their teacher. They have not paid me for their time. My time. I have not agreed to this dialogue, and I will just hit block. Sometimes I will warn them first, but often I won't. Someone wrote me an email asking me to debate them about Peter Singer, the Princeton philosopher, about whom I have much to say. And I said no. I did actually respond, but I just said no. I'm not going to do it. And because if they took a class and we were talking about the history of eugenics and I brought up Peter Singer and they were a student and they asked me questions, I'd have to engage that. That's my job as a teacher. Twitter is not my job. And so I would just say, if you get involved in a situation, remember who you really need to engage with ethically and who you don't. And when you don't, if you don't want to, just don't. So that's what I have to say about that.
To tack on there, obviously, I share all the privileges that David does. Plus, I'm Protestant, and I pick fewer fights than he does. So I got far less hate than even he does. But just from my background, not so much in history, but as covering politics as a reporter, I would add that there is an art and a skill to having a public persona on social media, and knowing how to phrase things and how things you say will be received, and what obviously you can't control who you are. That's a huge part of the response you get, and some people, just by virtue of who they are, will get more hate or less hate. But there's a skill to knowing how to phrase things to get the response you want, or to maximize the likelihood of getting the response you want. Knowing what phrasings will send messages to people that you don't maybe intend to send, and to a certain degree, you can only learn that by doing it, and the hard way. But as a political reporter who's intentionally trying to stay neutral and to not give an impression of favoring either side, it's really hard, and it takes a lot of cognitive work and practice to know how to enter that public sphere and how to frame your arguments so that you don't accidentally convince half the people reading you that you're expressing an opinion that you're not intending to share.
I was just gonna add, I don't get a ton of hate, mainly because I don't have that many Twitter followers. But the hate that I do get is more oddly enough. So the thing is, I am a global historian, but specifically U.S. foreign policy and the world, right? So I look at U.S. foreign policy and specifically its relationship with India. And so hate that I get is oddly enough from people who are like, Russia, what you're doing is, or like the research that you do is not really important. You're just looking at like old white dudes who are, making policy in like some DC think tank. And I'm like, first of all, incorrect. Second of all, even if I were, that's a very bad way to sort of understand why historical research is or isn't important, right? And so I think the best part about some type of hate that you get, usually this is hate that's like, it is bad faith, but it's like, it helps you think about why you're getting this sort of like reaction, is it helps you sort of think about what is the work that you're doing? Why is it important to you? And so yes, I will hit block if it's like a random person on Twitter, or I will engage politely if I get the odd student who has like an inappropriate question about Andrew Jackson or something. But when it's somebody who is a colleague or a purported colleague, you can use that experience not to engage with them, not to give them airspace, but to give yourself airspace in your head to try to figure out, okay, well, I'm getting this reaction. Obviously, I don't give a damn what this person says, but why do I care so much about the work that I'm doing, right? And that's sort of how I got to the specific research that I do now. Like I began as someone who was just studying dams in the United States. And then I slowly pivoted into somebody who was, studying US and India relations, who was studying the post-colonial process and the post-colonial environment in India, who was able to defend her research as not just US foreign policy, not just global history, but as actual South Asian history. And so when you get that type of maybe distrust or questions from your colleagues about your research, partially because of who you are, who you look like, it gives you the opportunity to rethink how you're going to defend yourself when you have to. Because if people know, if you're U.S. foreign policy historians for a long time, U.S. foreign policy, that subfield has mainly been white men. Obviously, more women are joining, but it's mainly been white. If you are a South Asianist, you know that, which is okay, most of it's people who are from South Asia, and that's fine. And so sometimes you have to defend yourself to various different types of subfields, and that's part of the fun. So that was a different type of hate that I sort of wanted to mention.
So I think in a lot of ways, I've unfortunately become rather desensitized to a lot of things because I get a lot of strange outreach. And, you get a lot of people who are very interested in Native culture broadly, or have just really wild misconceptions about who I am and what I believe and where I come from. So, I just get really strange messages in my inbox, and sometimes that is really can be really hateful, just because I do speak out a lot about mascotry and Native representation. And so I think, I do receive a lot of, I would say, like outreach about that specific topic and what it means to honor Native people and things like that. But I think as a Native woman, it's been really important to surround myself with community of other Native people and other Native women who are, most Native women you talk to that are in an academic sphere or a public, have a public persona, go through a lot of just honestly BS. And one of my really good friends is Dr. Adrienne Keene, who runs the All My Relations podcast, which is another fabulous podcast that I think all of you would be really interested in. And it's highly produced. It's very well done, and talks about various issues within each episode, tackles a different issue in Indian country. So it could be motherhood, it could be mascotry, it could be Native education. So it's just such a wonderful overview of things. But she's had to go on and off of Twitter several times. And I think that's something that I'm honestly like a little bit mentally prepared to just navigate the waters of. From like the moment I was admitted to Yale in high school, it was a very public forum that most people were able to say, oh, you're really only getting into Yale because you're a Native student and a Native woman. And so, classmates that I had been around for 12 years. And I think that was really, it wasn't my first experience with racism, but it was my first experience where I realized everything I do is pretty much going to be invalidated by non-Native people. And I'm going to be seen in this very non-intellectual light. So I think it's sort of what David mentioned earlier. It's really deciding where you're going to put your energy and who you're going to choose to respond to, and in which public forums you're going to choose to respond. But yeah, I get a lot of really strange stuff, and a lot of my work has really heavy implications around my safety, given missing and murdered Indigenous women. Like I spend a lot of time talking about it, and then I think sometimes people forget, like I am an Indigenous woman, and 1 in 3 Indigenous women experience violence and are not safe. And I think about that as a runner. I think about that as an academic. I think about that in my everyday life. And so I think, yeah, there's a lot of layers to that for me. So leaning into my cultural values and beliefs and understanding, that I am a storyteller, and that's in my family and that's part of our history, that I think really helps me mentally. So I think if you have Native students, allowing them that space to be valid and like intellectual and multidimensional with their cultural values and traditions and like what they're studying in school, like those things cannot be separated for us. They're so intersectional. And I've always leaned really hard into the mentors that allowed me to be all parts of myself at once, because I'm somebody who actively rejects the narrative of walking in 2 worlds. You'll often hear a lot of Native speakers and people talk about what it's like to be, Native, which is walking in 2 worlds. You live kind of in your traditional world or in a Native mindset, and you live in this like white world, or maybe in different ivory towers. But I think for me, that's very valid. And that may be the experience. It's totally something you feel. I've felt that before, the code switching, the switching between the different places. But I think truly, like, I don't turn it off, and I can't turn it off. And no matter what I'm speaking about, talking about, studying, reading, it's heavily impacted by who I am and what I look like. And so I'm really, I think, adamant about rejecting that 2 worlds narrative. And so if you do work with Native students, I think that's important to understand, is that, you don't turn it off, and that you are using your cultural traditions in the classroom. You're using that knowledge, and it's just as valuable in our communities. That is like sacred knowledge that is just as important as what I was learning in class at Yale. So this got me through a lot more in life, honestly. So I think that's just an important point I wanted to mention.
I'm deeply grateful for that, as well as for the other insight of our panelists. I want to be mindful of time. And so I'm going to draw our panel to conclude. I think Laura has our concluding remarks.
I do have a couple things I want to say. Thank you so much, Jack, for this fabulous panel you have put together. I want to thank everyone who is here, in our Zoom room, for participating in this gathering under the Baobab, to express the WHA's gratitude to Danae Dorami, David Henry, Varsha Venkata Subramaniam, David Perry, and of course, Jack Norton for putting it all together. As always, I extend the WHA's really deep appreciation for the stalwart labor of Carrie Vieira and Luke Scalone, who comprise the entirety of the WHA HQ. And without them, nothing would happen in our little world of the world. I want to leave you with a reminder that the WHA's fully online annual meeting with the theme of health globally begins on July 5th. The keynote address will be by Professor Beatrix Hoffman on the topic of migration and the right to healthcare. She'll be speaking from noon to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Tuesday, July 6th. More details and registration information about the conference are available at the WHA, that's THEWHA.org. And I look forward to seeing all of you again at our next gathering under the Baobab. Thanks for coming.